away from it! Sir, step back! This is mine! You can't take it! Let go of the chain! You did this to me! You ruined everything! Get your hands off me! Let go of me now!
My name is Chloe Vance, and I am 32 years old. At 8:20 on a Saturday night last October, 3 police cruisers entered the circular driveway of a rented mansion in Scottsdale, Arizona, while my older brother stood beneath a gold balloon arch cutting into a $500 birthday cake shaped like a Bitcoin. Behind the cruisers came a flatbed tow truck, its warning lights turning slowly against the glass walls, and inside the open 4-car garage sat a matte black Tesla Model X purchased 18 months earlier with my name, my credit history, and my social security number. There were more than 80 people at the party, most of them holding champagne or phones, and by the time the tow truck reached the garage, nearly every phone in the room was pointed at Trent. He had spent 4 years building an online life around the idea that he was a self-made crypto entrepreneur, the kind of man who understood wealth before ordinary people knew it was coming, and he had invited 3 potential investors from California to watch him announce his newest AI trading platform. What they watched instead was a repossession agent pull chains toward his car, while a detective asked whether the woman named as the primary borrower had ever given him permission to use her identity. Before I tell you what my brother said in that driveway, and why his answer mattered more than the handcuffs that came later, you need to understand what happened 5 days earlier in a quiet bank branch outside Columbus, Ohio. Because the police did not destroy my family that night, and neither did the tow truck, the real destruction began in a beige office with a framed photograph of a golden retriever, where a mortgage officer printed 14 pages and showed me what my family had been doing with the future I spent 10 years building. Welcome back to TN Story Glow, where people who have spent their lives making everything easier for everyone else finally learn what the word no costs, and families discover that blood may be thicker than water, but it is not stronger than a clean paper trail. If you have ever been treated like the emergency fund for somebody else's choices, leave the word empty in the comments and subscribe. Now let me take you back to that Tuesday morning. Some background so the numbers make sense. I work as a logistics data analyst for a mid-sized freight company in Columbus, which means I spend most of my days looking at movement, where a shipment began, where it slowed down, what was promised, what was delivered, and where money disappeared between 2 people who both claimed they had done everything correctly. In the evenings, I kept books for 3 local businesses, partly because the extra income helped, and partly because I have always found something comforting in accounts that reconcile. Numbers do not improve because someone cries, and they do not become less true because the person responsible shares your last name. I grew up in a house where money was never discussed directly, although its absence had a place at every meal. My father left when I was 8, not with a dramatic final argument or a suitcase by the door, but through the slower method some men prefer, becoming less available until one day absence was the only promise he kept. My mother, Susan, worked as an office manager at a dental clinic and raised Trent and me in a small house outside Dayton, where she treated appearances with the seriousness other people reserve for retirement accounts. We might eat store-brand macaroni 3 nights in 1 week, but on Sunday morning we sat in the 4th row at church, wearing department store clothes purchased on credit, because in my mother's economy it was sometimes acceptable to have no money, but never acceptable for anybody to know it. Trent was 4 years older than me and had the kind of confidence adults often mistake for evidence. He played quarterback, photographed well, and knew how to repeat somebody else's idea in a voice that made it sound like leadership. Teachers excused late work because they liked him, coaches described him as having potential, and my mother spoke about his future as if it were already an asset our family owned. He was always one introduction, one business idea, or one lucky market turn away from becoming the millionaire she had promised everyone he would be. I was the child who handled what happened while everybody waited for Trent's future to arrive. I remembered due dates, filled out forms, fixed the internet, found lost keys, and learned early that competence is often rewarded with more things to carry. When Trent failed, the failure was treated as part of his journey. When I succeeded, the success became proof that I could absorb another responsibility. By the time I left college, I understood the division clearly. Trent was the investment, and I was the reserve fund nobody expected to ask permission before using. At 22, I made a private promise that I would own a house before I turned 35. I did not want a mansion, a gated community, imported marble, or any of the props Trent later used to photograph prosperity. I wanted a small 3-bedroom craftsman in the suburbs with original wood floors, a patch of grass, and a front porch large enough for a swing. Most of all, I wanted a front door I owned, although at the time I did not understand why the lock mattered as much to me as the house behind it. For 10 years, I organized my life around that porch. I drove a 2012 Honda Civic whose transmission developed a nervous rattle above 60 miles per hour, so I learned to drive at 58. I lived in a second-floor apartment where the heating pipes knocked behind my bedroom wall, and the twins downstairs treated midnight as a group activity. I packed lunches, skipped vacations, bought work clothes from clearance racks, and replaced things only after repair became more expensive than denial. Every spare dollar from my salary and bookkeeping work went into a high-yield savings account, and by October the balance had passed $60,000. During those same years, Trent moved to Scottsdale and reintroduced himself to the internet as a crypto entrepreneur. His website used black backgrounds, gold lettering, and photographs of him looking beyond the camera as though markets were revealing secrets only he could see. He called himself a founder, a strategist, and once, during a podcast my mother sent to the family group chat, a financial architect. I listened to part of that episode while reconciling invoices for a bakery, and when he explained that poverty was often a failure of mindset, the bakery owner was in the next room deciding whether she could afford the latest increase in butter prices. My mother shared everything he posted. Airport lounges, rooftop restaurants, screenshots of follower counts, and finally the photograph that would come back to me in David's office. Trent standing in a Scottsdale driveway beside a matte black Tesla Model X, one hand on the roof and sunglasses hiding whatever expression belonged beneath them. Behind him stood a modern house with 4 garage doors and a fountain large enough to have its own utility bill. My mother's caption said, "My self-made son, hard work always wins." I clicked the heart button because that was still my role then. I did not yet know that the car in the photograph belonged to the version of me the banks thought existed. By the Tuesday of my mortgage appointment, my credit score had remained at 810 for 3 years. I checked it every Sunday morning with black coffee, the way other people check weather before leaving the house. I had one credit card with no balance, a paid-off car, no personal loans, and no missed payments. I kept my utilization under 10%, and treated every financial promise as though breaking it would prove my family right about how quickly security could disappear. The house I wanted sat in a quiet Columbus suburb with 3 bedrooms, dark green shutters, and a maple tree beside the driveway. I had toured it twice. The first time I checked the roof, foundation, windows, and furnace because I had not saved for 10 years to purchase somebody else's hidden emergency. The second time, after the real estate agent went inside to return a call, I stood alone on the front porch and imagined drinking coffee there before work. It was a modest dream, almost embarrassingly ordinary compared with the life Trent displayed online, which was part of why it felt honest. My appointment at the Chase branch was at 9:30, and I arrived 12 minutes early wearing my best navy blazer and carrying a folder containing tax returns, W-2s, employment verification, bank statements, and the property listing. The mortgage officer was named David Mercer. He had the calm manner of a man who had delivered good and bad news from the same desk for years, and after reviewing my income and savings history, he told me it was one of the cleanest files he had seen that month. For a few seconds, I allowed myself to believe the hard part was over. 10 years of saying no to trips, newer cars, better apartments, and all the small comforts that make time pass more gently had finally become enough for somebody behind a desk to say yes. David turned to his computer to pull the lender report while the printer started behind him, and I looked down at the listing photograph, already deciding where I would put my desk near the front window. Then he stopped typing. It was not a dramatic movement, just one hand remaining still on the mouse while his shoulders moved closer to the screen. I had spent most of my childhood reading my mother's face to determine whether a bill, a phone call, or some new problem had arrived, so I recognized the moment before bad news became language. David clicked again, removed his glasses, and asked when I had last checked my complete credit reports. I told him I checked my score every week. He explained that the number displayed by a banking app might use a different model or incomplete bureau information, and that a mortgage lender's hard inquiry could reveal accounts or recent activity the consumer dashboard had not reflected. The explanation was measured and professional, which made it worse, because professional language often approaches disaster as though moving too quickly might frighten it away. Then he turned the monitor toward me. The number was 482. I looked at it until the screen began to dim. A score of 482 was not the result of one forgotten payment or a card used too heavily during a difficult month. It belonged to somebody who had made a long series of promises, abandoned them, and stopped opening the mail. I had never missed a payment in my life, had never taken out a personal loan, and drove a Honda with a dashboard warning light that had been glowing for so many years I considered it part of the interior design. David collected the pages from the printer and placed them between us. The report showed 12 accounts, including an American Express Platinum card with $25,000 charged against it, a Chase Sapphire account carrying $18,000, 3 personal loans totaling $40,000 and already in default, 2 smaller revolving accounts, and an $85,000 auto loan opened 18 months earlier. With fees and the additional balances, more than $168,000 of debt had been connected to my identity. There are moments when the mind protects itself by becoming precise. I did not cry or ask why. I began adding. The auto loan was for a 2023 Tesla Model X. The address attached to it was in Scottsdale. I knew whose car it was before David finished turning the report toward me. I saw my mother's Facebook post, the gold caption about hard work, and Trent standing with one hand on a vehicle the bank believed I had purchased. The photograph had been online for more than a year, and I had looked at it without understanding that I was looking at a receipt. Identity theft sounds clean when spoken quickly. One person takes a name or number, and the other person notices it is missing. This did not feel clean. My name remained on my driver's license. My social security card was locked in a metal box inside my apartment, and my signature still belonged to my hand. Yet somewhere across 4 years, my brother had used all 3 to construct a life more expensive and more visible than mine. To open those accounts, he needed information I had never given him. 5 years earlier, while changing apartments, I left a manila folder at my mother's house for 1 week. It contained old tax returns, W-2 forms, and a copy of my social security card, and she told me she would put it inside the small fireproof safe on the bottom shelf of her bedroom closet. That safe held our birth certificates, insurance records, my grandmother's earrings, and apparently the raw materials required to mortgage my future. David explained what I needed to do next. Freeze my credit with all 3 bureaus, contact every creditor, file an identity theft report, make a police report, and preserve every document. Then he pushed the house listing back toward me and said the mortgage could not proceed while the fraudulent accounts remained attached to my file. The seller's offer deadline was Thursday, which meant the house with the porch swing would not wait for my family to become honest. I left the bank carrying 14 pages of evidence and sat inside my Civic for almost an hour while red leaves moved across the parking lot and collected beneath the tires. I did not cry, not because I was strong, but because crying would have required me to understand the full loss at once. 10 years of saving, 10 years of postponing my own life, and 10 years of believing that discipline was a wall high enough to keep my family's chaos outside. I spread the report across the passenger seat and followed the dates. The first card had been opened 4 years earlier, when Trent still lived in my mother's basement. More credit appeared after that, followed by the personal loans, the move to Arizona, and finally the Tesla. Seen separately, each account could be described as a mistake, an emergency, or a temporary bridge. Seen together, they formed a system in which my information entered at one end and Trent's lifestyle emerged from the other, while the only person who had controlled access to the original documents stood between them. I did not call Trent because there is no advantage in warning someone before you understand the full size of what they took. I did not call the police either, not yet. I started the Civic, listened to the transmission rattle awake, and drove to the house where I grew up. My mother was in the kitchen arranging silk hydrangeas in a glass vase when I walked in during the middle of the workday. Her eyes went first to my blazer, then to the folder in my hand, and she asked whether I had gotten the house. I placed the 14-page report on the granite island and asked who had opened the American Express card. She looked at the papers, then at me, and finally toward the hallway that led to her bedroom. The silk flower slipped from her fingers. She had not answered yet. She did not need to. My mother looked at the credit report for several seconds before touching it. She did not ask where I had gotten it, or whether the bank might have made a mistake, which told me more than any confession could have. Innocent people begin with confusion. My mother began with time, studying the pages as though the right arrangement of words might still place the disaster somewhere outside her kitchen. When she finally looked up, she reached for the tone she had used throughout my childhood whenever I brought her a problem that threatened the picture she preferred. Calm first, because calm made her sound reasonable and made whoever stood across from her feel unstable. There has to be an explanation. I pointed to the American Express account, the personal loans, and the Tesla loan tied to Trent's address. I told her the first account had been opened while he was living in her basement, and that every application carried information from the folder I had left in her care. I did not raise my voice. Anger would have given her something easier to answer than the documents. Her eyes filled before the truth reached her mouth. My mother has always cried most effectively at the exact moment another person might expect an apology. The tears changed the room, or at least they used to. They turned questions into cruelty, and consequences into proof that somebody else had gone too far. She gripped the edge of the island and said it had only been meant to last a few months. 4 years earlier, Trent had been developing a crypto trading system and needed capital to make the business look established enough for investors. His own credit had been damaged by what she called a few college mistakes, a phrase generous enough to cover unpaid cards, a repossessed pickup, and 2 years of pretending envelopes from collection agencies belonged to somebody with the same name. According to my mother, the first card had been temporary. Trent would use it to pay for software, advertising, and a trip to meet potential investors, then clear the balance as soon as the business began earning money. She had given him the information from my folder because I was not applying for anything at the time, and because my credit was strong enough to get him through what she described as a closed door. "You weren't using it," she said. I remember that sentence because it explained more than she intended. To my mother, good credit was not a record of 10 years of restraint. It was unused capacity. My savings were not the down payment on my future. They were money sitting still while Trent needed movement. Anything I had protected but had not yet spent looked available to people who had never protected anything. I asked whether she understood that the debt exceeded $168,000. She winced at the number, but not in the way a person reacts to learning what was stolen. She reacted like somebody hearing a repair estimate she hoped to negotiate down. She said Trent had made payments for the first 2 years and that the plan had worked until the crypto market turned against him. The new loans had covered the old balances, the Tesla had helped him project success, and projecting success had been necessary to attract the investors who would eventually repay everything. There it was, the architecture of Trent's entire life. He needed to look successful so that someone would give him the money required to become successful, and every failure of that plan became evidence that he needed a larger version of the same illusion. My mother told me the car mattered because investors expected founders to look established. She said people in Trent's industry judged appearances quickly, and a man arriving in an old vehicle could lose a deal before entering the room. I thought about my Civic in the driveway, the warning light on the dashboard, and the mortgage file sitting inside it. Apparently, one child had been allowed to look unsuccessful while building something real, so the other could look successful while building nothing. I asked when she planned to tell me. She said there had never been a reason to upset me because Trent had always intended to fix it before I noticed. She said this as though secrecy became kindness when the victim remained unaware long enough. In her version of events, the problem was not that my identity had been used. The problem was that the timing had failed, and the bank had shown me the accounts before Trent's next opportunity arrived. Then she asked what I planned to do. I told her David had instructed me to freeze my credit, contact the lenders, file an identity theft report, and make a police report. The words had barely left my mouth before her face changed. The tears remained, but the softness disappeared beneath them. You cannot go to the police. It was the first completely honest sentence she had spoken. She came around the island and tried to take my hand, telling me that Trent would not survive a criminal case, that his business would collapse, and that one report could destroy everything he had spent years building. She spoke about his company, his reputation, and the investors he expected to meet at his birthday launch in Scottsdale. She spoke about legal fees and prison and the shame our family would carry through church. Not once did she mention the house I had just lost, or the years required to earn back a financial identity I had never damaged. When I reminded her that the mortgage had been denied, she called it a delay. The house was only a house, and another one would come along after the accounts were paid. I was capable, she said. I had a stable job, savings, and time. Trent was different. He was sensitive, under pressure, and close to the breakthrough he had worked toward for years. That was my mother's oldest arithmetic. The stronger child could absorb more damage, which meant damage done to her counted less. My ability to survive what they did had become their permission to do it. She promised the new trading platform would launch after his birthday event and said investors were already interested. If I stayed quiet for a few weeks, Trent could close the funding, clear the cards, bring the loans current, and repair everything without involving outsiders. She called it a family solution, although I noticed the family had not been invited to participate until the victim discovered the bill. Then she said something that would matter later. She said I had always supported Trent's ambitions, and that everyone knew I wanted the family to succeed. She did not say I had given permission, not yet, but I heard the first pieces of that argument taking shape. In my mother's hands, years of quiet cooperation were already being converted into consent. I looked at the woman who had taught me to save birthday money, avoid debt, and never sign anything without reading it. She had broken every rule she gave me because Trent had asked for access to the future those rules created. For most of my life, I thought her favoritism meant she loved him more. Standing in that kitchen, I understood that love was not quite the word. She believed in Trent's importance more than she believed in my ownership of myself. I told her I needed the truth in writing, every account she knew about, every document she had given him, and every time she had helped him access my information. She stepped back as though I had asked her to testify in court, which, eventually, somebody might. Chloe, don't turn this into an investigation. It already was one. The only question was whether I would conduct it badly, because the suspects knew my childhood nickname. I gathered the report and put it back inside my work bag. My mother followed me toward the front door, moving through promises and warnings as though testing keys in a lock. Trent would repay me. The family would make a plan. I could stay in my apartment another year. Police would misunderstand. Banks were heartless. Prosecutors wanted headlines. People at church would ask questions. My father, if he were alive, would never have wanted this. The dead are useful in family arguments because they cannot correct the person speaking for them. At the door, she asked me to give her 48 hours before doing anything permanent. The offer on the house expired in less than 48 hours, although she did not seem to remember that. I told her I would not contact Trent until I knew exactly what he had done. She heard that as a concession. It was not. I drove home with the credit report buckled into the passenger seat beneath my work bag. On the way, my real estate agent called to ask whether the pre-approval letter had come through. I watched the phone ring until voicemail answered. I could not yet say the sentence aloud. Somebody else might buy the house because my brother had purchased a Tesla with my name. Back at the apartment, I changed out of my blazer, made black coffee, and cleared the kitchen table. I did not know how long the work would take, but I knew what kind of work it was. Fraud is rarely invisible. It survives because the people who see separate pieces do not place them beside one another. I went to the closet and pulled out a plain gray 3-ring binder left over from a freelance bookkeeping client. Then I opened a package of dividers and labeled 5 tabs: credit bureaus, lenders, applications, communications, and reports. The labels were ordinary, which helped. Ordinary systems are useful when the thing being contained is not. The first task was quarantine. I froze my credit with Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion, changed the passwords on my banking, email, tax, and retirement accounts, and added multi-factor authentication anywhere that offered it. I removed my mother as an emergency contact from 2 financial profiles I had forgotten she could access. By early evening, nobody could open a new account under my name without turning what had been a quiet fraud into a much louder attempt. Then I began contacting the lenders. Fraud departments do not move at the speed of panic. They move through hold music, case numbers, affidavits, and representatives required to repeat scripts before reaching the sentence you need. I stayed on the phone because staying on the phone was something I knew how to do. By midnight, I had opened disputes on 7 accounts and requested application records, signature pages, billing statements, and login histories where available. The documents began arriving the next morning. I printed everything. Some people assume a stolen identity is used for necessities, rent, groceries, or medical bills, and sometimes it is. Trent had used mine to construct a showroom. The American Express statements included luxury hotels, expensive restaurants, nightclub charges, designer clothing, business coaching programs, and a $4,000 retreat in Tulum marketed to men who use the word abundance while selling one another access to private chat groups. I highlighted travel in yellow, luxury purchases in pink, business expenses in blue, and transfers in green. After 20 pages, the colors stopped looking like categories and began looking like a psychological evaluation. The chase card paid for dinners with people Trent called investors online. The personal loans moved into an account attached to his company and then out again in smaller pieces. Rent on the Scottsdale house, payments to a video production service, monthly charges for a private aviation membership, and deposits to event planners. He had not used my credit to build a profitable company. He had used it to build evidence that a profitable company already existed. The auto loan documents arrived Wednesday afternoon. I opened the PDF and found the application showing me as the primary borrower, with Trent listed beneath me as co-borrower. My annual income had been increased by $30,000. My address had been replaced with his. My phone number contained 1 altered digit, enough to prevent a verification call from reaching me without making the application appear incomplete. At the bottom sat a digital signature in my name. It did not resemble mine. Trent had not even respected me enough to forge it carefully. The payment history showed that he had made regular payments for more than a year, which explained why the loan remained hidden from the consumer dashboard I checked. Then the payments stopped in July. By October, the account was 90 days past due, and the lender had already assigned the vehicle for recovery. A note in the case file listed repeated unsuccessful attempts to locate the Tesla at Trent's registered business address. The car was being kept inside the gated garage of the rented mansion, hidden not from criminals but from the bank that legally owned most of it. I added the application, payment history, and recovery notice to the binder. By then it was Wednesday evening, and the seller of the Craftsman house had accepted another offer. My agent sent the message with 3 careful paragraphs explaining that the buyers had conventional financing and could close quickly. She said another property would come along when I was ready. She meant it kindly. People say another house will come along because there is no polite way to say this particular house is now somebody else's future. I opened the listing one final time and looked at the porch swing. Then I saved the page as a PDF, printed it, and placed it behind the credit report. It was not evidence of Trent's fraud. It was evidence of the cost. That night, my phone buzzed while I was indexing the loan documents. Trent had sent a voice message. He sounded relaxed, the way people sound when they believe somebody else is still protecting them from consequences. He said Mom had told him I was stressed, that the market had been difficult, and that his new AI trading platform was weeks away from changing everything. He told me not to make any sudden decisions, because involving banks or police could interfere with the funding he planned to use to repay the accounts. Then he asked me not to damage his credit. I listened to the message twice, not because I misunderstood it, but because arrogance sometimes deserves confirmation. The man who had reduced my score from 810 to 482 was worried I might damage his credit. I saved the audio, exported the message, printed the transcript, and placed it under communications. Then I looked at the binder open on my kitchen table and understood what was still missing. I had accounts, signatures, spending records, and the person who supplied the original documents. What I did not yet have was Trent admitting, in his own words, exactly what he had placed under my name. The following morning, I typed a message designed to sound like the sister he believed he knew. I told him I was frightened, confused, and trying to understand how much money I needed to prepare for. I asked him to list every account connected to me so I could build a budget and avoid doing anything that might disrupt his launch. For 3 minutes, the typing bubbles appeared and disappeared. Then his answer arrived. It began with the words, "It's not as bad as Mom made it sound." And beneath that sentence, my brother started listing the accounts. The list arrived in 4 messages, each one more useful than the last. Trent named the American Express card, the Chase account, the 3 personal loans, the 2 smaller lines of credit, and the Tesla. He described the cards as operating expenses, the loans as bridge capital, and the car as a branding asset, which was how he turned theft into vocabulary from a conference room. Then he told me not to include any of it in my personal budget because he was handling the balances and expected to clear everything after the launch. I read the messages at my kitchen table with the gray binder open beneath my hands. He had done exactly what I needed, but not quite in the way I needed it. He admitted knowledge of every account and treated the debt as his responsibility, yet nowhere did he say I had not given permission. A person reading the exchange without context could still imagine an irresponsible family arrangement, something foolish but voluntary, the sort of private agreement that collapses and then becomes a civil dispute rather than identity theft. The difference between those 2 versions was one word: consent. I took screenshots, exported the conversation, printed the pages, and placed them behind the voice message transcript. Then I answered carefully, asking why he had never told me the accounts were being opened if we had supposedly agreed to them. I expected another careless confession. What I received instead was the first sign that somebody had warned him. He stopped replying. 20 minutes later, my mother called. I let it ring once before answering, because by then every delay carried information. Her voice was controlled, almost tired, as though I were the difficult person requiring management. She said Trent had contacted her because my questions were making him nervous before the most important weekend of his career. She reminded me that I had always encouraged him, had attended 2 of his early business presentations, and had once told him I believed he could make the company work. All of that was true. None of it meant he could sign my name. My mother continued. Years earlier, when Trent first began discussing the trading business, I had told the family I would help if I could. I remembered the conversation. It had happened over Thanksgiving dinner after he spent 40 minutes explaining a business model nobody else understood. I had said I would review his budget and help him organize the bookkeeping once he had a real plan. In my family, an offer to examine a spreadsheet had apparently matured into authorization to borrow $168,000. Susan said Trent might have misunderstood what I meant, and that misunderstanding was not the same as theft. She urged me to stop putting accusations in writing until the three of us could sit down with cooler heads. Then she said she had saved messages from those early years showing that I supported his business, and if banks or police became involved, she would have to be honest about that. There are threats that announce themselves, and there are threats served in the voice of a mother explaining fairness. This was the second kind. I asked whether she was saying I had authorized Trent to open credit cards and loans in my name. She avoided the question 3 different ways. First, she said families rarely use formal language when helping one another. Then she said memory was imperfect. Finally, she said it would be cruel to force Trent to prove an agreement everybody had understood at the time. Everybody except the person whose name appeared on it. When the call ended, I sat in front of the binder and felt the investigation change shape. Until then, I had believed the case depended on showing who opened the accounts. The signatures, addresses, purchases, and text messages already did most of that work. What I had underestimated was the story my family would place around those facts. Trent would not deny using my identity. He would claim I had permitted it, that the arrangement had been informal, and that I had only called it fraud after his business struggled and my mortgage fell through. It was not a strong argument. It did not need to be strong. It only needed to make the banks hesitate. Fraud departments are built to identify transactions, not untangle 30 years of family conditioning. A forged signature was evidence, but so was a message from me saying I wanted Trent to succeed. A loan application from his computer was suspicious, but if my mother claimed she had watched me approve it, the clean line between victim and participant could become the muddy family disagreement they preferred not to enter. For the first time since the bank, I understood why Susan had asked for 48 hours. She had not needed time to find money. She needed time to build a version of the past in which I had agreed. I opened every old message thread I still had with Trent and my mother. There were years of birthday wishes, requests to check tax forms, links to his interviews, and photographs my mother sent whenever he appeared beside something expensive. I searched words like business, loan, credit, card, help, investment, and permission. What I found was a record of the role I had always played, encouraging, practical, available, and careful never to promise money. 3 years earlier, Trent had asked whether I could invest $20,000 in his company. I had refused in writing. I told him my savings were reserved for a home and that I would not lend money to family. He replied with a laughing emoji and said he respected the discipline. 2 months after that exchange, the first personal loan had been opened in my name. I printed the conversation and placed it at the front of the communications tab. Then I found an email from the year the American Express account appeared. Trent had sent me a pitch deck and asked whether I would serve as the company's finance director on paper until he hired somebody. I declined because I did not understand his trading model and did not want my name attached to a business I could not verify. He answered that I worried too much. The card was opened 11 days later. I printed that too. By Thursday afternoon, the binder no longer showed only that Trent had used my identity. It showed that he had repeatedly asked for legitimate access, received a refusal, and then created the access himself. My mother could claim confusion, but the dates did not seem confused. Numbers are useful that way. People remember what protects them. Dates remember what happened. I called David at the bank and asked him to document the exact purpose of my Tuesday appointment, the documents I brought, and the fact that I had represented myself as having no outstanding debts. He could not give legal conclusions, but he sent a short letter confirming that I had applied for a mortgage based on one credit card with a 0 balance and that the additional accounts were unknown to me when the lender report was pulled. My real estate agent sent the original offer paperwork showing that I had committed $60,000 from my own account toward the purchase. The seller's deadline, the denial, and the competing offer were all dated within 48 hours of my discovery. It was difficult to argue that I had knowingly allowed my credit to collapse while simultaneously trying to use it to buy the one thing I had spent 10 years saving for. Then I contacted the companies hosting my freelance bookkeeping records and downloaded login histories showing where I had been during several account openings. One personal loan had been submitted from Arizona while I was logged into a restaurant's accounting system in Columbus. Another card application carried an IP address from my mother's home during a week I had been attending a freight conference in Indianapolis. The evidence did not arrive in one cinematic revelation. It came in ordinary files with unhelpful names, email headers, timestamps, and customer service notes. That is how most truth enters a room, quietly, badly formatted, and requiring somebody to care enough to put it in order. By Thursday evening, I had a timeline running across 6 sheets of paper taped to the wall above my kitchen table. On the left was the first request Trent made for money. On the right was the Tesla default. Between them sat every refusal, application, payment, address change, public post, and message I could verify. When I stepped back, the pattern was clearer than the individual crimes. Each time I refused legitimate involvement, a fraudulent account appeared soon afterward. Each time Trent's business needed to look larger, my available credit became smaller. Each time payments began failing, another loan opened to preserve the appearance that nothing had failed. And Susan's role sat at the beginning of the chain. She had provided the folder, allowed applications to use her address, and then spent 4 years celebrating the lifestyle those accounts purchased. Whether she had typed a single number into a form almost stopped mattering. She had not merely looked away. She had kept the door open and told me the room behind it was still secure. At 8:12 that night, a message appeared in the family group chat. My mother had written it to 14 relatives. She said there was a serious misunderstanding involving Trent's business and asked everyone to avoid gossip while the immediate family resolved it privately. She described me as overwhelmed by a mortgage disappointment and said old informal agreements were being remembered differently under stress. The wording was careful. She did not accuse me of lying. She simply placed instability beside my name and family loyalty beside hers. Within minutes, 2 aunts replied with praying hands. A cousin wrote that money should never come between siblings. My uncle told us our father would want peace. Nobody asked what had been opened in my name. That is the advantage of controlling the first version of a family story. By the time facts arrive, everybody has already chosen the emotion through which they will read them. I did not defend myself in the group chat. I took screenshots, printed the thread, and placed it in the binder. Then I left the conversation open, because people who believe they are protecting a family often document more than people trying to expose one. 10 minutes later, Trent sent a private message. He told me Mom had overreacted, that he wanted to settle things directly, and that I should fly to Scottsdale for his birthday event. He said 3 serious investors would be there, and that once they saw the platform demonstration, they were likely to fund the company. If I attended, he could introduce me as an early supporter and show them the business had family backing. After the term sheet was signed, he would pay the overdue accounts and give me enough for a larger down payment than the one I had lost. It was the first actual offer he made. It was also the clearest explanation of what he needed from me. Not silence alone, performance. He needed me standing beside him while he described the fraud as support. My presence would convert forged applications into a family investment more convincingly than any document Susan could invent. If I smiled in front of investors and allowed Trent to call me an early financial partner, every dispute I filed afterward would carry a photograph of me helping him sell the opposite story. I reread the invitation and understood why he had included the address, the schedule, and the private gate code. He believed I was still negotiating. He believed the lost house had made me frightened enough to accept repayment, and that one public appearance could clean the paperwork by making the lie look mutual. For most of my life, Trent had mistaken my quiet for a lack of strategy. That mistake was becoming the most valuable thing he had ever given me. I replied that I would consider coming, but I needed confirmation that no other debts existed and that he would pay everything once the investors funded him. He answered immediately, repeating the full list and promising in writing that the cards, personal loans, and Tesla would all be cleared from the investment proceeds. Then he added that after Saturday, there would be enough money to make the whole credit mess disappear. I saved the message before he could reconsider it. After that, I opened the Federal Trade Commission identity theft portal. I entered every account, amount, opening date, and address, uploaded the forged Tesla application, and attached the refusals Trent had received before the fraudulent accounts appeared. I completed the form but stopped before the final submission. The report would begin a process I could not privately reverse. Creditors would block accounts, demand police documentation, and turn their attention toward the person who benefited. Trent's launch might collapse. My mother's version of the family might collapse with it. There would be no payment plan over Sunday dinner, and no future holiday where everybody agreed not to mention what happened. On the table beside my laptop sat the house listing, the photograph of the porch swing, and my mother's group message describing me as overwhelmed. I thought about what she had said in the kitchen, that I could recover because I was capable. She was right about the ability, and wrong about the obligation. Surviving damage did not make me responsible for protecting the person who caused it. I saved the federal report as a draft and began a second document for the Columbus police. Then I called the fraud investigator listed on the Tesla recovery notice and gave him the Scottsdale address, the vehicle location, and the birthday event schedule Trent had sent me. He could not promise when the recovery team would act, but his interest changed when I explained that the garage would be open for valet traffic and that a local police report was being prepared. Before we ended the call, he asked how I knew the gate code. My brother invited me to the party. There was a pause. Does he know you reported the vehicle as fraud? Not yet. The investigator gave me a direct number and told me to call once a police case existed. By midnight, the gray binder had become too thick for the rings to close cleanly. I removed the house listing from the back and placed it inside the front cover, where I could see it each time I opened the file. Then I wrote a title across the spine in black marker. The Trent Vance Audit. I stood the binder upright on the kitchen table and looked at the words. The name made it sound like revenge, but that was not what the work felt like. Revenge is emotional and impatient. This was slower. I was not inventing a punishment. I was removing myself from the place where Trent had stored the cost of his life. Friday morning, I called the Columbus Police Department and made an appointment to file the report in person. I packed the binder, my identification, the lender files, and the printed timeline into a canvas tote. Before leaving, I opened the FTC draft one more time. At the bottom of the page was the certification stating that the information was true and that knowingly making a false report could carry criminal penalties. My mother's warning returned to me. Old agreements were being remembered differently. I looked at the documented refusals, the forged signature, the mortgage denial, and Trent's promise to repay accounts he claimed I had authorized. Then I checked the certification box. The cursor hovered over Submit. For 32 years, my family had depended on the distance between what I knew and what I was willing to make official. I closed that distance. I clicked Submit. The confirmation page appeared without music, warning lights, or any sign that something permanent had happened. It gave me a reference number, instructions for creditors, and a list of documents to bring to law enforcement. 4 years of fraud had entered the federal record through a button no larger than my thumbnail. At the Columbus police station, I handed the officer the gray binder and walked him through the timeline. He did not react to the luxury purchases or Trent's photographs because police officers hear stories about expensive stupidity every day. What changed his attention was the sequence of written refusals, followed by accounts opened from addresses and devices connected to my family. the forged vehicle application mattered most. It showed my name as the primary borrower, Trent as the co-borrower, a false income, a false address, and a signature that did not belong to me. By early afternoon, I had a police case number. The report identified me as the victim and listed the cards, loans, and vehicle as disputed accounts opened without authorization. I sent copies to every lender, the 3 credit bureaus, and the recovery investigator handling the Tesla. He forwarded the vehicle records and party details to his company's Arizona team, which requested a civil standby from Scottsdale police because the car was hidden behind a gate and Trent had already avoided several recovery attempts. The party invitation became useful in ways my brother had not intended. It gave them the address, the gate code, the event schedule, and confirmation that the garage would remain open for valet traffic. Trent had spent years using access as proof of status. On Saturday night, access was what allowed the truth into the driveway. I bought a budget flight to Phoenix and carried the binder beneath the seat in front of me. During the flight, my mother sent 6 messages. The first asked whether I was coming to Scottsdale. The second reminded me that a public disagreement could destroy Trent's funding. By the 6th, concern had become instruction. She told me to stand beside my brother, confirm that I had supported the company from its beginning, and let him repay the accounts after the investment closed. Then she added the sentence she had been building all week. "You did agree to help him, Chloe. Please don't rewrite history because you're upset about the house." I read it twice and saved it. My mother had finally converted her defense into a direct claim. She was no longer saying Trent misunderstood me. She was saying I had consented. I answered with one question. When did I agree that he could open accounts or sign loan documents in my name? She did not reply. Silence is not proof by itself, but when placed beside 4 years of documents, it knows where to stand. In Phoenix, I met Detective Miller at a Scottsdale precinct and gave him a duplicate set of the vehicle application, my police report, the FTC affidavit, Trent's messages, and the conversations showing that I had refused to invest or attach my name to his business. The Columbus case remained the foundation, but Arizona had the vehicle, the address, and the person benefiting from it. By then, Wells Fargo had confirmed that the Tesla was actively assigned for repossession and that the primary borrower had reported the loan as fraudulent. Miller explained that the tow truck could recover the vehicle if it could reach it without breaking into the property or causing a breach of the peace. The officers would remain there to keep the recovery from becoming physical. The identity theft investigation was larger and would continue after that night, but the forged vehicle documents and Trent's written admissions had already given them enough to question him and act if he lied, obstructed the recovery, or attempted to turn the situation violent. I appreciated the distinction. Real consequences rarely arrive in one perfect package. They come as separate files, separate agencies, and separate people each carrying one part of the weight. At 7:40 that evening, I drove my rented sedan through the open gate of Trent's mansion. The valet looked at the car, then at my blazer, and decided the mismatch was not his problem. Inside, the house had been arranged to resemble wealth under laboratory conditions. A champagne tower stood near the entrance. Gold balloons framed a stage bearing the logo of Trent's AI trading platform. A screen above the pool displayed phrases about disruption, freedom, and generational wealth, while servers carried food through rooms furnished by somebody else. Trent was speaking to 3 investors when he saw me. For 1 second, his face showed the fear beneath the confidence. Then he crossed the room, embraced me for the audience, and introduced me as his sister and one of the people who had believed in him from the beginning. That part was true, which was why the lie worked so well. He pulled me into the catering kitchen and began explaining what would happen after the term sheet was signed. He would pay the delinquent vehicle balance first, then settle the cards and refinance the personal loans. He said my score would recover, I would find another house, and eventually I would realize that bringing the family through one difficult season had been worth it. He did not apologize. He described repayment as the reward I would receive for continuing to cooperate. When I told him I had never authorized a single account, he stopped pretending the conversation was friendly. He said Mom remembered differently, that old messages proved I had supported the business, and that nobody would believe a data analyst from Ohio had been unaware of accounts receiving payments for years. Then he told me what he actually needed. I would stand beside him during the investor announcement and confirm that the original funding had come through a private family arrangement. After that, he said, the distinction between formal permission and informal permission would no longer matter. It was an efficient plan. One photograph of me smiling beside him could create doubt around a binder full of refusals. Trent understood optics because optics were the only part of business he had ever mastered. I told him I wanted to see the presentation first. He heard surrender because he had never learned what patience looked like when it belonged to someone else. At 8:15, he walked onto the stage and began telling the room that his company had been built without institutional money, supported instead by family members who believed in his vision before the market caught up. Then he gestured toward me. Every face turned in my direction, and I understood that this was the moment he intended to transform theft into history. Before I could move, the warning beep of a reversing truck passed through the glass walls. The first red and blue reflection crossed the ceiling. Guests turned toward the driveway as a flatbed entered through the open gate, followed by 3 Scottsdale police cruisers. The music stopped badly, not with a clean fade, but with a scrape of sound that made the silence afterward feel accidental. Trent reached the driveway before the recovery agent reached the garage. The Tesla sat inside beneath white lights, polished for the party, and positioned where arriving investors could see it. He stepped between the vehicle and the tow equipment, announcing that the car was private property and that any attempt to remove it would be theft. Detective Miller asked him whether he was Trent Vance and whether the Tesla had been financed under Chloe Vance's identity. Trent looked toward me before answering. It was a small mistake, but people notice where a man searches for permission. He said the vehicle belonged to the company and had been purchased through an authorized family financing arrangement. Then he pointed toward me and told the detective I was not a victim. I was an early financial partner who had become angry after a mortgage application failed. That was the counterplay Susan and Trent had spent 5 days preparing. He did not deny the accounts, the car, or the use of my information. He placed consent around them and hoped the word family would make the edges difficult to see. For a moment, it worked well enough to change the driveway. The investors stopped looking at the tow truck and looked at me. Guests lowered their phones slightly. A family dispute is less exciting than a fraud, and people prefer explanations that allow the party to continue. Miller asked whether I had authorized the loan. I said no. Trent laughed and told the crowd that I had attended his early presentations, reviewed business plans, and promised to support him. He said there were years of messages proving I believed in the company. I agreed with him. I had believed in him. I had offered to review budgets. I had encouraged him after failed presentations. I had wanted my brother to succeed. Then I handed Miller the messages in which Trent asked me to invest $20,000, and I refused because my savings were for a house. I gave him the email where he asked to attach my name to the company, and I declined. I showed him the dates. The first personal loan opened 2 months after the first refusal, and the American Express card opened 11 days after the second. Supporting a brother was not permission to become his borrower. Trent changed tactics. He said my mother had witnessed the agreement. Miller asked whether she had witnessed me sign the Tesla application. Trent said the loan had been handled electronically. The detective showed him the application and asked why my income had been inflated, why my address had been changed to Arizona, and why the phone number contained 1 altered digit. Trent said an assistant prepared the paperwork. When asked for the assistant's name, he gave the name of a man who had not worked for his company until 6 months after the loan originated. That was the moment the argument stopped being a family disagreement. It became a man creating new facts in front of a detective who already held the old ones. The recovery agent moved toward the Tesla again. Trent grabbed the chain and refused to release it. 2 officers stepped between him and the truck. He began shouting about lawyers, investors, and unlawful entry, each sentence louder than the previous one, as if volume could replace ownership. The three investors left together. They did not announce their decision or wait for cake. They simply walked toward their car, while Trent watched $2 million of imagined funding disappear through the same gate the tow truck had entered. Then he turned toward me. For 32 years, I had seen Trent disappointed, embarrassed, indebted, and temporarily defeated. I had never seen him encounter a consequence he could not transfer. The expression on his face was not shame. It was disbelief that the designated recipient had rejected delivery. He moved toward me, calling me a liar and saying I had destroyed the family over a house. An officer intercepted him before he reached me. When Trent shoved the officer's arm away and tried to return to the Tesla, the officers restrained him against the cruiser and placed him in handcuffs. Miller informed him that he was being detained in connection with the fraudulent vehicle documents and for interfering with the lawful recovery. The broader financial investigation would continue through the Ohio report, the lenders, and the agencies reviewing the interstate applications. Phones rose again across the driveway. This time, Trent could not choose the angle. The tow truck pulled the Tesla from the garage while the Bitcoin cake remained inside beneath 35 burning candles. Nobody sang. The influencers recorded. The investors drove away. The man my mother had called self-made stood beside a police cruiser, watching the bank reclaim the most visible thing my identity had purchased for him. My phone began ringing before I reached the rental car. Susan's name filled the screen. I let the call end and listened to the voicemail in a gas station parking lot several miles away. She said I had humiliated Trent, destroyed his company, and ruined the family name. She asked how I could do something so permanent over money and a missed house. Even then, after the forged applications, the public lie, and the handcuffs, she described what happened as something I had done to him. I sent one reply. I told her Trent destroyed his life when he decided my future was cheaper than earning his own. I told her the FTC report, the police file, and the lender disputes were already official. Then I said I would not be the place where this family stored its consequences anymore. I blocked her number after the message showed delivered. The legal aftermath did not move as quickly as the party, because real systems almost never do. The creditors investigated the applications, matched addresses and login records, and removed the fraudulent accounts one by one after receiving the identity theft report and police documentation. The Tesla was sold after recovery. Trent's investors withdrew, and the financing he had expected never arrived. As investigators examined the business accounts, they found that much of what he called trading revenue came from new clients whose money had been used to cover older promises. The fraud attached to my identity was not his entire business, but it was the first loose thread authorities had been given permission to pull. My mother mortgaged part of her house to pay his attorneys. Relatives who had sent praying hands to the group chat began calling me cruel, then stopped when I asked whether they were offering to place the debt in their own names. Support for sacrifice becomes quieter when paperwork is included. Restoring my credit took months. I sent certified letters, answered the same questions repeatedly, and learned that proving you did not spend money can require more work than spending it. The score did not return all at once. It climbed in pieces as each account was blocked and removed, until one rainy Tuesday morning I opened my banking app and saw the number 810 again. I sat at the kitchen table with black coffee and looked at it for a long time. The number did not feel like victory. It felt like the return of something that should never have left. An hour later, I called David. The second mortgage appointment happened at the same desk beneath the same photograph of the golden retriever. David reviewed the corrected reports, my savings, and the police documentation, then printed a pre-approval letter. The original Craftsman house had been sold, and I never saw the inside of it again, but 3 weeks later I found another house on a quieter street. It had 3 bedrooms, an old maple near the driveway, and a front porch wide enough for a swing. I bought it. On closing day, the agent handed me the keys, and showed me how the deadbolt caught unless the door was pulled firmly toward the frame. After she left, I stood alone in the entryway and locked it once, then unlocked it and locked it again. For 10 years, I thought I was saving for a house. What I was really saving for was the right to decide who entered. That is my story. 1 mortgage appointment, 14 pages of debt, a gray binder, and a birthday party where my brother finally received the bill for the life he built in my name. If this story reminded you that being capable does not make you responsible for absorbing everyone else's damage, leave the word audit in the comments. Family is not permission, support is not consent, and love that requires your silence is only another debt waiting to be disputed.